Hello comrades, recently there was a response video made about my video called Subjective Theory of Value Debunked by Labor Theory of Value. Now the reason that video was made in the first place was to have a pre-watch video before watching my response on Maddie's video about the Labor Theory of Value. That video could have been better made and I should have put more time and effort into that video, but that's besides the point. The point of this video is to respond back to the video made on that video given the chance, you say, to go further detail. This video is called Theory of Incoherence by none other than Shane Killian. If you don't know who Shane Killian is, he's an anarcho-capitalist that has been proven to make jokes about killing communists, getting very unfactual sources, and not listen to criticism. Strawman economic concepts proven by his confrontation with another content creator that goes by the name of Vicky. He has also tried to deny the rates of the CDC not being a higher but rather lower, and doesn't have much of an infection rate, which he provides sources from blog posts that is too very unfactual. The content creator, who I'll be calling Shane Killian in this video, got various things wrong about Karl Marx, Marxism, and our goals as communists are as well. He also very much strawmans the labor theory of value. It only comes down to labor, which is completely false. I will demonstrate and argue why it is false in this video. As I have said before, this video is a good chance to be used to emphasize what I talk about and what Karl Marx talks about in his works. I urge you to just read Karl Marx yourself. As in his video, he has made rude remarks, lied about the labor theory of value, taking quotes out of context, and not given full detail into providing reason, and so much more we can get into in this video. Before starting off, I will link the response video in the description and the video that was responded by Killian. It will be provided in the description of the video down below. Now, let's begin.
I can already tell this is gonna fail. Smith and Ricardo worked on a cost theory of value where they knew there were certain problems. Marx's labor theory of value considered labor as the only determinant of value and ignored all the problems that had been pointed out, especially by Ricardo.
This is not totally incorrect because Adam Smith and David Ricardo did talk about cost theory of its natural prices. However, for a tool to be produced, did take labor time to create said tool to create more products, which is to where they talk about labor theory of value. Rather the fact either Smith and or Ricardo admitting them being incorrect, I cannot find anything to back that claim up. As for your take on Marx's theory of value, it is simply not true. Marx did not believe labor is the only thing that makes up a commodity. In the last sentence of the first section of Capital Volume 1, Marx says, quote, "Lastly, nothing can have value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value." End quote, Karl Marx. Karl Marx makes it very clear that a thing has to have a utility to it or else it can't store any value. However, the labor put into the useful product is what determines its value in capitalist society. Also, Marx is talking about how value works in capitalist society in this case, since all the economic takes are focused on capitalist society. Value in capitalist society is not based on the direct utility of a given product, but how much socially necessary labor time went into making the thing, which makes the thing, in Marx's terminology, a commodity. The reason why products and things are not exchanged based on the demand and need under capitalism is because you need to quantify utility, and utility is something that is purely quantitative and subjective. And you can't effectively price or measure and objectively standardize things based on what is purely quantitative and subjective. If a person could do that, then that would unravel so many riddles and mysteries of not just economics, but also philosophy and human understanding that everyone would have to need to answer and essentially look into, even though we've already essentially went on this very subject. Anyways, moving on.
Actually, it was Karl Menger,
which was one of the founders of the Austrian School of Economics.
Oh boy. Subjective theory of value was developed in the 1870s by Carl Menger. It was also formulated independently around the same time by Leon Walras, the father of general equilibrium theory, and William Stanley Jevons, the first ecological economist. This was decades before the Soviet Union even existed, and even longer until the Cold War. I don't know how you think you've debunked anything when you can't even get the timeline correct.
I definitely agree from this response. I clearly should have been more specific in that passage, so I shall do so here in this video. What I meant was that during the Cold War, and even still today, the U.S. had made it mandatory for economic classes in U.S. schools to teach the subjective theory of value, rather than the economists many founding fathers looked into the past, because they were afraid that students could go into the same conclusions Marx has from Smith's and Ricardo's works. This was created by the times of the 1940s. This is even still practiced in many American public high schools and non-public colleges and universities. I did not mean that the subjective theory of value was created for this reason. I definitely should have been more specific. However, the use of this theory is still used. I mean, you could be a smartass, or quote-unquote smartass, in this instance and say, quote, well, yeah, because the U.S. government knows it's correct. But then that leaves the debate of the quality of the education in the United States, which is off topic.
No, they weren't. The Austrian School of Economics didn't even really exist. This was the event that got the ball rolling on it for Menger. Jevons was English and didn't become aware of Walras and Menger until after he published his theory in 1871. Walras wasn't Austrian either. He was French, and he wasn't aware of Jevons or Menger. So, not only did you screw up the timelines, as there was nothing even remotely resembling the Cold War or the Soviet Union at this time, you had to lie and make it sound like they were part of some kind of conspiracy or something when they weren't even aware of each other at the time. If multiple people come to the same conclusion independently, that speaks to there being a very high likelihood of it being correct. And that's why you had to lie like this, isn't it?
Oh boy, a lot to jaggle here. Okay, first off, the Austrian School of Economics was founded in the late 19th century by Karl Menger, Eugene von Berg, and Friedrich von Wieser. Which even then, during the times of this founding, Jevons did sympathize with the Austrian School of Economics. He even confirms this in his late notes. As for Walras, he was a big contributor of the Austrian ideas of economics, which even Karl Menger even talks about in his classes. Also, one thing that is messed up about this argument that you implied the Austrian School of Economics only accepts Austrians to be a part of the higher ranks of the school, which is not true. The process to be a higher rank is if you have to pass multiple tests agreed to most of the higher ups and could create critiques through Austrian theory. This is not limited by nationality. Also, in our last patches of this video, I definitely addressed the problem I did provide. However, to call it a lie is by far not considerate. I mean, I knew I am dealing with Shane Killian here, where there's a meme where he just says lie, lie, lie over and over again. But I really thought Shane Killian would be grown about this at this point. As for the remark, which is not proven true, I would have to ask. So when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels found each other's works and agreed independently until Friedrich Engels would help Karl Marx, it means that their analysis on capitalism is most likely correct, as well as Karl Speicher and Joseph Wiedemer and many more people? According to you, that is the case.
It's funny how it was Ricardo who set up this theory in his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, and then later in that same chapter goes on to refute it. Let's say you've got a tomato plant. You put the tomato fruits into a soup. You make another soup with the leaves and the stems. Exact same labor, but people love the soup made with the fruit, but not with the stems. So they won't sell for the same price. You'll have to charge a much lower price for the stem soup if you can get them to buy it at all. Socially necessary labor was used by Marx to paper over this problem, which completely refutes the theory. Socially necessary labor is completely circular reasoning because how do you know what labor is socially necessary? It's the labor that adds value, of course. Sorry, this is not allowed by the methods of rationality. The only way this could have any validity is if you can come up with an objective way ahead of time to tell which labor will be socially necessary or not. And you can't base it on utility to the consumer because that is subjective theory of value, which you claim to have debunked.
Oh boy, a misconception to tackle and a really bad straw man too. Okay, in the first chapter of the Principles in Political Economy and Taxation, Ricardo goes to say, quote, as the inquiry to which I wish to draw the reader's attention relates to the effect of the variations of the relative value of commodities, and not in their absolute value. It will be to the little importance to examine into the comparative degree of estimation in which the different kinds of human labor are held. We may fairly conclude that whatever inequality there might originally have been in them, whatever ingenuity, skill, or time necessary for the acquirement of one species of manual dysentery more than another, it continues nearly to the same from one generation to another, or at least that the variation is very inconsiderable from year to year, and therefore can have little effect for short periods on the relative value of commodities. End quote, David Ricardo. He even moves on to the next section with, quote, even in that early state to which Adam Smith refers, some capital, though possibly made to the accumulated by the hunter himself, would be necessary to enable him to kill his game. Without some weapon, neither the beaver nor the deer could be destroyed, and therefore the value of these animals would be regulated, not solely by the time and labor necessary, but in their destruction, but also the time and labor necessary for providing the hunter's capital, the weapon by the aid of which their destruction was effected. End quote, David Ricardo. In the same section, he also writes, quote, economy in the use of labor never fails to reduce the relative value of a commodity. Rather, the saving of the human labor necessary to the manufacture of the commodity itself, or in that necessary to the formation of capital, by the aid of which it is produced. End quote, David Ricardo. Then he goes on to the next section. He even justifies, quote, in the former section we have supposed the implements of the weapons necessary to kill the deer and salmon to be equally durable and to have the result of the same quantity of labor, and we have seen the variations of the relative value of deer and salmon depended solely on the varying quantities of labor necessary to obtain them. In every state of society, the tools, implements, buildings, and machinery employed in different trades may be of various degrees of durability and may require different portions of labor to produce them. End quote, David Ricardo. He does not refute against this in any light, and even just keeps continuing on the subject for the rest of the chapter. That even here he specifies about how we can still determine the value of the deer and beaver just on its own, and see how it adds the labor putting into killing the deer and beaver. Of course, there is a natural value. No one disagrees on that, especially Marx. However, one, it seems you're using value and pricing interchangeably, and two, you yourself disregard the possible natural pricing of the soups. Speaking of which, you fail to regard the use value of the soup and the labor time necessary to create the soup in the first place. While the one with stems is not as useful as the one with the tomato fruits, the one with tomato fruits is tasty. It's good. You can eat it just fine. As for the ones with the stems, that is not the case, which is not as much use value put into the product. You say that this would be subjective theory of value, but Marx himself goes on use value in wage, labor, and capital. He even says, quote, and finally, let us remember that the current price always stands either above or below the cost of production, according to the sale of the commodity takes place until the favorable, unfavorable period of the industry, according as the market price of the yard of linen stands above or below its former cost of production. It will the percentage vary at which the capitalist who has made use of the new and more faithful means of production sell above his real cost of production. End quote, Karl Marx. He even says in the first section of Capital, quote, every useful thing as iron, paper, and etc. may be looked at from 2 points of view, of quality and quantity. It is an assemblage of many properties and may therefore be of use in various ways. To discover the various uses of things is the work of history. So also is the establishment of socially recognized standards of measure for the quantities of these useful objects. The diversity of these measures as its origin partially to the diverse nature of the objects measured, partially in convection. End quote, Karl Marx. He even brings up in the final sentence, which I'll quote once again, quote, "Lastly, nothing can have value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value." End quote, Karl Marx. So, to simplify and or give a definition of use value in the Marxist theory, the utility of a given thing, the way of how a given thing poses any use value, is by being able to satisfy its needs and desires due to the abilities or properties inherent of a given thing. If a given thing does not have any use value, then it can't be a commodity, nor is there any point in talking about it.
No, it doesn't. They never put in this socially necessary crap. In fact, Ricardo pretty much said that's the one thing you can't do. Use the final value as an indicator of what kind of labor does and does not go into creating value. I quote, "The value of a commodity, or the quantity of any other commodity for which it will exchange, depends on the relative quantity of labor which is necessary for its production, and not on the greater or less compensation which is paid for that labor." If the value originates from the labor itself, there shouldn't be any extra factors you need to look at to determine if value is being added. This is the problem with labor theory of value that Ricardo discussed, that he had no solution for. In fact, he specifically wrote, "I am not satisfied with the explanation I have given of the principles which regulate value."
I like how the first quote actually mentions the amount of labor is determined as its value for exchange, which is a commodity that even specifies for relative quantity of labor necessary, which he quotes this to try and refute that thought. I mean, that quote is even used by Marx in Value, Price, and Profit to debate against whom he calls Citizen Weston. Besides, we've already debunked the misconception of the labor theory of value by brain-dead libcaps and ANCAPs and liberals that can't understand. The labor theory of value does take into consideration of the use value to create a product, which is used as well to determine the price on its value. As for the second quote, I honestly think that's irrelevant to the point being made and the analysis of how value is determined to determine its price. You can't quantify something that is inherently quantitative.
I have no clue what this is supposed to mean. It's certainly not anything Smith said.
I mean that the laborer, the worker in this instance in capitalism, has to perform a certain amount of labor to produce a product, which the worker had already sold his labor power to his employer, obviously because he's a worker. Would take it and sell it into the market, would have to determine the price and the product based on its set value. Prices and value cannot be used interchangeably here, which would depend on the competition of the employer's fellow friends. The employer realizes they have to pay the worker and purchase more materials to continue the work days, which will set the price of the highest amount people will buy.
Let's take care of this crap right here and now. From Ricardo himself, and I quote, "Mr. Malthus appears to think that it is a part of my doctrine that the cost and value of a thing be the same. It is, if he means by cost, cost of production, including profit. It's only you morons who try to divorce it from price and come up with crap like exchange value and use value to try and differentiate it, when the whole idea of this is to try and figure out why goods are priced the way they are."
Jesus, maldición. Okay, to clear everything up, value is not price, period. You can only quantify something that is not quantitative, that was made for exchange, which is a commodity. Commodity production is production for exchange value, which in turn facilitates accumulated labor. This does not answer the questions of the prices in the first place. This does answer the questions of the prices in the first place and explains the reason why an employer is free to bid its prices. Even then, that same quote, David Ricardo makes the distinction between price and value. Prices are exchangeable value. The value is expressed in money, which is exchanged in product determined by the price. Value is a common substance or abstract for its use value, and is particular the mere congregation of homogeneous human labor, of the labor power expended without regard of the mode of expenditure. All that things now tell us that human labor power has been expended in their production, that human labor is embodied in them. The value of a commodity is measured by the amount of socially necessary labor time put into that created the value in the first place. Value is distinct from price, period.
Let me save you the effort here. Subjective theory of value means that a good or service is valued by how much of a benefit the consumer feels he will get from the transaction. As long as he values the good or service more than he values the money to pay for it, he buys it. This isn't difficult.
Perfect. We have Shane Killian's definition of subjective theory of value, except with his definition, it has holes. First off, the consumer can still feel the product is not good for its price, but still need it in the first place. So, if it is based on the benefit of the consumer, that should mean he controls his own way of paying, correct? No, he doesn't, because the price is the product, and because the price of the product and the value of said product to determine its price is not set by the consumer or the laborer. The owner is, which, if the owner owns the means of production and distribution, they are the capitalists, or just bourgeois. Better yet, it doesn't explain the reason for the price set the way it is in the first place. It doesn't calculate how wages are determined. It seems not to have any distinction from one product for use and another for exchange. Subjective theory of value can only be explained in this instance when we have generalized utility production, which is explained by Marx would be socialism/communism. The only reason is because a utility is a product for use value, which is already quantitative. I'll point out to you again, you can't quantify something that is already quantitative.
I don't even understand what it is you think we're supposed to see in the first place.
If the individual is truly free in capitalism, then the individual consumer should be able to determine the price of a product if value is set on the benefit of the individual consumer. You don't see this in capitalism. As far as the last response, which I will not put into this video, I am aware I may be confusing, but it's still onto the mention of how the individual totally decides his own benefit. Yeah, totally decides his own benefit. Yeah, totally.
Okay, so what I think he's trying to say here is you can't haggle. Well, what does that have to do with subjective theory of value?
How the individual consumer feels.
No, the owner of the store sets the price. If you're talking to the owner, you can haggle if he's willing to do so. Why would you expect cashiers to have the authority to haggle?
Oh, Shane Killian, once again, you're missing the point. First off, the owner of the store is the capitalist. He owns the store. In other words, he owns people's means of production and the means of distribution, which is the definition of a capitalist part of the capitalist class. Your classes are your social relations to the means of production. Second off, it goes back to your definition of subjective theory of value, which I'll even quote. Subjective theory of value means that a good or service is valued based on how much the benefit of the consumer feels he will get from the transaction. As long as he values the good or service more than he values the money to pay for it, he buys it. So if it is based on the benefit of how the consumer feels, then the consumer is the one that should determine the price in practice with the theory. So it may create a credible praxis. You don't see this happening, however, and the price is still determined by an individual above the individual consumer.
Exactly! You're either going to agree to the price or you're not. You agree to the price. You, the purchaser, the consumer. If you think the benefit you'll get from the product is worth the money, you'll buy it. Otherwise, you won't. You just described subjective theory of value. Not very well, but still.
But the consumer didn't set the price, and even then we have to ask, why am I buying the mac and cheese? Because I am most likely to get it and to eat it to satisfy my hunger, which is something I don't have free will over. I have no choice but to take it for my needs or not. I only have to exchange, or I cannot. That's not how the individual feels that would benefit them in that instance, because they're under the threat of hunger, and that hunger is growing worse and worse. It's practically a gun pointed to your head saying you either buy the product or you get more hungry. The product is already there, and we already have plenty to go around, yet they are distributed only based on the exchange determined by another person above your rank? How individualist! You agree to the price because you're under the threat of hunger. You wouldn't be under the threat of hunger in the first place if the capitalist is to just give the can away. I agree to the price at the cost of my economic freedom.
Yeah, of course they're gonna call the cops if you take it without paying. That's called stealing. What does that have to do with what factors figure into the price of it?
But the thing is, if they are going to pay, if they were to pay part of the product on how they feel benefits them, then they should be able to take it, assuming this practice lines up. So you can say, with the subjective theory of value, that he would have paid the price he feels benefits him. Thus, he should be able to pay for it, correct? So why are the cops being called? Could it be that maybe prices are not determined based on how the individual consumer feels and onto the capitalist that determines the product based on the use and labor put into the product? Well, the only way you can accurately explain that situation is yes. Yes, it is.
So he actually does think that subjective theory of value means haggling. If you don't have a clue about what something is, you can't be said to have debunked it. I don't have to do anything else to refute this imbecile, since I've made it clear this guy doesn't have the first idea. If you don't have a clue about what something is, you can't be said to have debunked it. Really, I don't have to do anything else to refute this imbecile, since I've made it clear this guy doesn't have the first idea what he's talking about, but let's continue anyway out of sheer morbid fascination.
I'll quote you again, Shane Killian. Subjective theory of value means that a good or service is valued based on how much the benefit of the consumer feels he will get from the transaction. As long as he values the good or service more than he values the money to pay for it, he buys it. So if I do have the ability to feel my benefit from the transaction, I should be able to determine the price through the means of the market set in place. The problem is you don't have that power buying at all. You have the power to buy the product or not, yes, but you have to buy the product through your own material needs. That is exchanged for what commodities you have for exchange to get that product from a capitalist, which would be quantified based on the layer put into the product, including how useful it is as well. You claim that you have refuted me, but in reality you refuted yourself. Oh, St. Killian, once again, you've done it! You've done it again! You can't keep your theory in line with the practice!
Why don't we enlighten this with another Ricardo quote? I cannot get over the difficulty of the wine, which is kept in the cellar 3 or 4 years, or that of the oak tree, which perhaps originally had not 2 shillings expended on it in the way of labor, and yet comes to be worth 100 pounds. Wine is more valuable than grape juice, even though no other labor is done other than just letting the bottle sit there a while. An oak tree is worth a lot more than a sapling, even though no one put any of their labor into actually growing it. Because it's not about the labor. It's about how useful it is in fulfilling people's desires.
Let's have Marx have a say in this. Quote, the utility of a thing, it is a use value, makes it a use value. But the utility is not a thing of air. Being limited to the physical properties of the commodity, it has no existence apart from that commodity. A commodity such as iron, corn, or a diamond is therefore so far as it is a material thing, a use value, something useful. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. When treating of the use value, we always assume to be dealing with the definite quantities of such dozens and watches, yards of linen, or tons of iron. The use values of commodities furnish the material for a special study that of the commercial knowledge of commodities. Use values become a reality only by the use of consumption. They also constitute the substance of all wealth, rather whatever may be the social form of that wealth. In the form of society we are about to consider, they are in addition the material disparities of exchange value. End quote, Karl Marx. Now, let's address the dumb dichotomy. Wine is more valuable than the grape juice because there has been more labor put into the wine than the grape juice, and how useful it is, and how it satisfies more people. Karl Marx agrees. But if we are to take the distinction of the value of the sampling and then the tree, that can be solved by looking at the labor it takes to obtain both. With the sampling, you can pull it out with your bare hands, using gloves or dig it out. With a tree, you need an axe or a chainsaw to cut down the tree. Then the possibility to cut it more depending on how you are going to use it, as well as the tree is bigger and more useful than the sampling. Thus, with these two reasons, is the reason explained through the labor theory of value why the wine is more valuable than the grape juice and why the tree is more valuable than the sampling. I'll quote Karl Marx once again. Quote, lastly, nothing can have value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value. End quote, Karl Marx.
If anyone has a clue what this moron is trying to say, please comment.
That's a subjective theory of value is bullshit.
Ask me how I can tell you've never run a business before in your life.
Well, yeah, because I'm not a bourgeois or petty bourgeois. I'm a proletarian. Even then, how is this relevant?
So, for those of you who can speak English, what he's saying is, actually, I have no clue what it is he's saying.
What I am saying is that the individual has no power when they decide anything. It is really them who accepts or does not when the subjective theory of value, even the definition you provide yourself, Shane Killian, suggests as so. As for the explanation of capital and commodities, commodities is a product for exchange value, which takes the worker to produce that commodity. Then when the employer who is buying the labor power of the worker obtains the product and sells it, he now has to determine the wage of the worker, which is labor being accumulated. As well as the definition of capital is the accumulation of labor. This is English, and it's not hard to understand if you look at it outside and inside. If you don't get it, I can explain it in Spanish. La mercedina es producto por valor de cambio que necesita un trabajador para producir esa mercedina. Luego ganó el empleado. Que está a cambio de la fuerza de trabajo del trabajador obtiene el producto y lo vende. Ahora tiene que dominar el salario del trabajador, que es trabajo acumulando. Además de la definición de capital está la acumulación de trabajo.
Yeah, it's pretty clear you didn't understand anything about your economics classes.
I mean, I have, and I took into the consideration of how price is determined, but then I questioned the reason it is the price. And why the need of the word capital and the tools of production, as the tools of production, rather than the accumulation of labor. If I haven't, I wouldn't know this in the first place. Period.
GDP and the tools of production are two entirely different things. Yeah, I know. I'm just watching the rest of the video to see the train wreck happen.
I never said they were, but they are related to each other because it takes tools of production to create a GDP, which is a gross domestic product. It is a monetary measure of the market value of all goods and services produced in a specific time period. To have that, you need tools of production. Do you need a hearing aid, Shane Killian? I mean, I know you are an older fellow, but I didn't expect you to have hearing problems that young.
Have you ever seen a supply-demand graph?
Oh, Shane Killian, if only you knew how many times mentioning supply and demand doesn't solve anything. 1. Supply and demand only comes to the grounds of the supply of the product and that being sold. This goes back to the debate between Karl Marx and Citizen Weston. We have to ask, how do you determine high wages and low wages? According to supply and demand, this is the acceptance of the popular slang terms of low and high as something having a fixed meaning, despite the fact wages are self-evident, that wages can only be said to be high or low as compared with a standard by which to measure their magnitudes in the former, supply and demand. It can't calculate the certain amount of money for a certain amount of labor put in. By what law is supply and demand regulated? The relations between supply and demand of labor undergo perpetual change with them, the market prices of labor. If the demand overshoots, the supply wages rise. If the supply overshoots, the demand wages sink. Although it might in such circumstances be necessary to test the real state of demand and supply by strike, for example, and or any other method. But if you accept supply and demand as the law of regulating wages, it would be childish as useless to declaim against the rise of wages, because according to the supreme law, you appeal to the perpetual rise of wages is quite as necessary and legitimate as a empirical fall of wages. If you do not accept supply and demand as the law of regulating wages, I again repeat the question: why a certain amount of money for a certain amount of labor?
The worker gets paid a wage because he believes the wage he's given is worth more than the time and effort he put into earning it, and his employer believes that the value the worker adds to the product is more than the value of the wage he's paying him. If even one of those aren't the case, the exchange wouldn't happen. It's a win-win, positive-sum increase in wealth that benefits both sides. I don't really expect you to have an answer for that because, let's face it, no Marxist ever does, but can you at least state the situation properly?
No, Shane Killian, the worker is forced to be employed because he is under the threat of poverty. The very system of capitalism either has him work or he is homeless, hungry, and dehydrated, despite the fact we have enough shelters, food, and water to go around for them. This is not given because there is no exchange being made for the product. He put in the effort, yes, but that is because the employer decides his wage after selling the product. Once you sell the product, you have to determine on how much you yourself earns the cost for needs to continue the workday and to pay your worker a wage. The worker's wage is not what he believes it is, what the material conditions are set. You can work 4 hours and produce a product worth $40. Then the capitalist, assuming he doesn't have competition, sells it for $40. He has to keep money for himself, for his own needs, so he can take $10. He also needs to pay for what he needs to continue the workday, so he pays $20 for what he needs for the workday. Then he pays you a wage of $10. Get that in your head and let it sink in. You worked $40 worth of labor and time, but because of the material conditions of capitalism that is set for the capitalist to make money, he has to pay you less than what you are worth. This is not because the capitalist is being evil, mind you, of course, but because the material conditions, you can never be paid what you are worth. You can have higher jobs that pay higher wages, yes, but the process is the same, and it gets worse if the capitalist chooses to lower the price, which is the result of competition. This is the exploitative nature of capitalism and explains how wages are determined.
Yeah, definitely never ran a business before. Not even sure you've worked a real job.
I have worked a job before. Without revealing too much, I worked at a computer shop, fixing computers and putting them together. But even then, that's irrelevant because you don't have to be a worker to know how wages are determined and to do the math of the wage. It's like St. Killian is just gonna walk to a veterinarian and tell them, "Yeah, I bet you never even been an animal before." You don't have to be an animal to know how they work and how to help them. You don't have to be black to know about black struggle. You don't have to be an American to know about American politics. And you don't need to be a worker to know about how a worker's relation to the means of production lies on. You need the education, and then you need to know it. You need the education to understand what is going on. You don't need to be that.
I'm sure that made sense in your head. To the rest of us, it sounds like you're saying they didn't get paid what their labor's worth. But the whole point is, who decides what their labor is worth? If they don't think their labor is worth that wage, they wouldn't take that job. And if they think their labor is worth $10 an hour, which is the number you seem to have been working with, although I can't really tell because none of that made the slightest amount of sense, but they can't find anyone to actually pay them $10 an hour, then in what sense is their labor worth that much?
Except there is no other way to do that process than the supply and demand argument, but we already went over that. Of course, the capitalist decides what they are worth because they put in the labor to make the product in the first place. This only changes depending on the offer of the wage, but how that wage is determined is still the same. Thus, you can't be paid what you are worth because it's still the same. It's the same process. A capitalist has to look out for the business too. You of all people should know this. Because of this, the capitalist will pay you the lowest amount you are willing to work for. As for the labor, it depends on the labor time put into work that determines their worth, which does not determine their wage. Their wage is determined based on how much the product is sold for.
It really sounds like you're insisting that human behavior should reduce to an equation. Sorry, it doesn't. There's the amount people are willing to sell their labor for and the amount employers are willing to pay them. As far as those two match, that's the wages people get paid.
It only is. Are you trying to imply wages are determined based on human behavior? If so, then that's wrong. Your wage is determined based on the labor you put into the product and how much that product is being sold for by the capitalist. Also, it seems you're trying to say the worker sells their literal labor. They don't. They sell their layer power. Layer power is your mental and physical embodiment of labor. As for the agreement analogy, there is no way for the worker to demand a better wage until they get the job. Their wage is already set. There is no collective bargaining in the interview to be hired. You collectively bargain once you get the job. This is usually done through trade unions and labor unions. Now I have to ask, have you worked the job? Because if so, you would know this is the case.
What other answer could you possibly want?
Do the fucking math. Analyze. Explain the relations of production. Do the homework. It's not that hard. God damn it.
We've already seen how little research you've put into this, so it should come as no surprise that you seem to have missed Hayek's pretense of knowledge. But you really should give it a read. It goes into this issue in great detail.
I know you have watched my video, but did you see my description? I clearly have given sources, and I have looked into the research of that video, which you would have found in the description. Those sources talk about those issues at hand and give descriptions of the subjective theory of value and labor theory of value I was using. Also, what the fuck is X pretense? Are you trying to say pretense or experience?
No, that's Marxism that fails to take that into account. We have this little thing called Say's Law, which you guys deny up and down a blue streak. And we constantly ask Marxists to consider the issue of how the means of production gets created to begin with. You guys just seem to assume that a factory is just there and a capitalist bourgeois is using it to exploit the workers. When the truth is, he came to be an owner by personal sacrifice. Either he had some money and decided not to get the benefit of it with things he could purchase, choosing instead to put it into the business, or he sacrificed part of his future by going into debt to investors whom he now has to pay back. So if you just forcefully take the factory from him, what of that personal sacrifice he's made? What of all the stuff he never gets to buy for himself so he can put it into the business? What of the debt he's still in to the investors whom he still has to pay back somehow?
I have clearly explained time and time again how Marxism does explain how employers get money in the first place through using the products that the worker produced that is sold into the market, then calculates the expenses. Hell, I'll even quote Marx here. Quote, but even considering him and his assertion, it would cut both ways, and while he presses it only into the one direction of the amount of wages of the is a constant magnitude, then it neither increased nor diminished. If then, in enforcing the temporary rise of wages, the working men act foolishly, the capitalists, in enforcing a temporary fall of wages, would act less foolishly. Our friend Weston does not deny that under certain circumstances, the working men can enforce a rise of wages, but their amount being naturally fixed, there must follow a reaction. On the other hand, he follows also that the capitalists can enforce a fall of wages and indeed continuously try to enforce it. According to the principle of the constancy of wages, a reaction ought to follow in this case not less than the former. The working men, therefore, reacting against the attempt at or act of lowering wages, would act rightly. They would therefore act rightly in enforcing a rise of wages, because every reaction against the lowering of wages is an action for raising wages. According to Citizen Weston's own principle of the constancy of wages, the working men ought to therefore, under certain circumstances, to combine and struggle for a rise of wages. End quote. Karl Marx. As for Say's law, the idea of Say's law is just production is just that production is a demand, and then there is supply in one market that exceeds the demand. But the problem is that runs into overproduction and lack of distribution of goods, which is very rapid in capitalism. Overproduction is, well, in the name. It is production of products too high. There is a lack of distribution. Where there's a lack of distribution, there were even economic problems that caused crisis, led to more people being affected negatively from that problem, as well as it runs into the same problem of supply and demand, which we already covered. St. Killian is also trying to say here that we are stealing, and we don't take into the consideration of the business how there is a means of production. The reason there is a means of production is even answered by Marx, because there's a material incentive to produce things. As for the consideration of the business, Marx does not take into the consideration much, because that is irrelevant to the social relations of the means of production the bourgeois has. They buy workers' labor power, they sell what they produce into the market, they alienate them from their own labor, they put the worker into the level of a commodity, and they can never pay the worker based on the labor time they actually put in. This is very much exploitative in nature, and the problem that it is not because of the bourgeois as an individual, but the problem is the very existence of the bourgeoisie. You keep missing the point, Killian. We don't hate the bourgeoisie as individuals. We hate the fact that they exist and their social relations to the means of production is the way it is. Never them as a person. As for the stealing argument, grow the fuck up. We are not stealing anything from anyone. During the time of the workers' revolution, there would be wealth distribution, but that is because they stole our surplus value in the first place. Even then, it's a means to an end. The point is to abolish classes, not to just have a mass class take control. Even then, the bourgeois would most likely get cared for, assuming he does not counter revolt the masses. It's going to have workers own their own production, have their own workers plan economy, and even have the input-output model on their own production, and have their own control onto the state that is a state not in the traditional sense, and a state essentially controlled by the masses to soon abolish itself in the new society. To quote Frederick Engels, quote, "We have seen, besides the material conditions of production and the circulation, inevitably develop the large-scale industry and the large-scale agricultural, and increasingly tend to the entire scope of this authority. Hence it is absurd to speak of the principle of authority as being absolutely evil, of the principle of autonomy as being absolutely good. Authority and autonomy are relative things, whose spheres vary with various phases of the development of society. If the autonomists confine themselves to saying that the social organization of the future would restrict authority solely to the limits within which conditions of production render it inevitable, we could understand each other, but they are blind in all facts that make the thing necessary, and they passionately fight the world." End quote. Frederick Engels.
Because it is. Look at a CEO's job. Look at what the typical business owner does. If anything, they generally put in more work than any individual worker. And when you consider that against what they draw from the business, it often ends up being lower than what they earn by hour, often even below minimum wage. This is another question you brain-dead simps can't ever answer. Why does everyone who works for a company deserve to get paid except the owner?
Okay, we have, but their work is to accumulate other people's work. They have to do the math. They have to pay workers, they have to sell products, they push their products, they give their worker a wage, and that is not even that's not even valuable to the labor that they put in. Besides, we can look at a CEO's life, and only 24% of employers and business owners in the United States get paid below minimum wage, and the reason is usually caused by the environment around them. Majority of CEOs in America get paid $500K to $1 million a year by owning the means of production. It only gets a bit higher to 46% of the CEOs of the world. Besides, even if this were the case, this weren't the case, it's not work to steal other people's surplus value. As for your question, that's completely irrelevant, and I am pretty sure my past arguments had answered that. As for the name calling, really? You're calling me a simp? Bitch, weren't you the one that was crying about stealing the factory? Boo-hoo! What about the employers? But they agreed to it. Shut the fuck up. You call me a simp, yet you're one of the biggest bootlickers I ever seen. Jesus Christ, forget Shane Killian. You're Simp Killian now. Or better yet, fucking Cuck Killian. Holy shit.
I'd love to respond to that. Unfortunately, I don't have the first idea what he just said.
I was mentioning the fact that prices of a product can change depending on the situation of the workplace that needs to be done. You might have to pay your workers more, you might have competition, etc. Either way, you have to resort to fixing out the price or not to get to that point. If it's still hard to understand, I can explain it in Spanish. Menciona el ejercicio que los precios un producto pueden cambiar dependiendo de la situación del lugar de trabajo y eso debe hacerse. Es posible que tenga que pagar más sus trabajadores. Es posible que tenga oficina, etc. De cualquier forma trendes que recrear fijar el precio o no llegar a ese punto.
Would you please show your work?
I did in this video. Shane Killian, everybody, the man that can't keep his facts straight, the man that blatantly calls people's names in discussion, the person who strawmans, the person who can't do math and doesn't understand math either, the simp / cuck for the bourgeois, the man that takes authors out of context and doesn't read the full passage, the fucking meme all people with common sense love to make fun of, and best of all, the man who got Marx's labor theory of value completely wrong. He just gave his definition of subjective theory of value that just is in the name, subjective. That it is based on how the individual consumer feels, which cannot be done for something to be quantified. It has to already be quantified and have layer put into the product to have the value of the product to be set. Basically, you can quantify something that is not already quantified, which is the value of labor put into the product, which its value determines the price on the labor performed. For value to be truly subjective, we have to generalize utility production. But that is because it is inherently quantified. Plus, to generalize utility production is described as production in socialism / communism, which you can only work without the need of money. The labor theory of value is the most accurate way you can explain how value is determined materially in our society and how it works throughout society. Because the thing is, you can't quantify something that's inherently quantitative. The subjective theory of value can only be explained in socialist and communist society, where there is no state, money, or class. but not in capitalism, where it has these things in the first place to begin with. Value has to be determined on the exchange rate and on the labor put into that product for exchange. If it is to have an accurate price. It's fucking sad to see anyone takes this guy seriously. I mean, usually through just Google searches and actual reading of sources he provides, which is very small, by the way. You can see he is very much incorrect. I mean, it's really dumb to strawman these dumb. I mean, it's really dumb to strawman these dumbass libertarian capitalists, anarcho-capitalists, and conservatives can't understand. Marx never says labor is the only thing that creates value. He even makes that clear in the first chapter of the first section of Capital Volume 1, as well as other works as well. Also, never thought I'd have to say this. We are not here to steal anything. Also, Shane Killian, if you're watching this, which I know you are because you've somehow found my channel, in all consideration for your health and well-being, delete your fucking account.
Bruh, look at this dude. Wait till you see the. No, 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 no.